All right, so welcome everybody to Close Readings, Investigations in Yogic and Tantric Thought. This is our second episode, and James, welcome. Good to see you.
Thanks, Ben. Good to see you. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. Very much so. So James and I had an idea as a way of beginning each episode is just to share a brief anecdote or maybe an insight about the practice of reading. This Patreon is really about close reading and getting intimate with the texts. So this is just an opportunity for us to further explore this. So for today, I wanted to share actually an anecdote from my own personal experience of reading. And this is actually from when I was a grad student at Harvard University. And the story begins with our Sanskrit teacher, Guy Levitt, who James and I both studied with. He was actually leaving Harvard and he was going on to a new position at Columbia. And we had a lunch for him in Harvard Square at this Indian restaurant, Maharaja. And at the lunch, first of all, just to say, he was an extraordinary teacher, a great mentor, and he really embodied deep knowledge of Sanskrit with humility. And so he was a real gentleman. I think, James, you would agree.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very gentle, very, very intelligent person.
Yeah. Definitely someone to emulate as a scholar. So I just remember this vividly from the end of our lunch. We all kind of collectively asked him if he had any advice for us as graduate students. And his advice kind of took me off guard. His advice was, when you're in India and you're studying with traditional pundits, traditional Sanskritists, don't ask them to read the text you want to read. Read the text that they want to read. Read the text that they're interested in. And I remembered this. It stayed with me. And when I was doing my doctoral research, I was in India and I was with this traditional pundit, and his name's Anjaneya Sharma. It was a great opportunity to read with him because he's just a very rare Sanskrit pundit of amazing caliber and also a very generous and humble soul. And as we were reading, I remembered Guy's advice. And so I asked him what he would like to read. And so we started reading this grammar text. Now, this text was probably one of the most dry Sanskrit texts one could imagine. It was on meta rules of grammar, not just grammatical rules, but these like strange meta rules. But I had this very powerful experience of reading the text that he wanted to read, which was, as he was reading the text, he was reading it orally, and I was staring at it in front of me. And he was translating it from Sanskrit to Sanskrit. So he would read it in Sanskrit, and then he would give Sanskrit words to clarify each one. He would rearrange the syntax of the sentence. And as I was looking at
So basically writing a live commentary, writing a commentary as he was speaking.
Exactly, which is a very traditional way of teaching in this kind of classical tradition. And I remember this fascinating experience of reading with him. I was staring at the text, and it went from being very obscure and difficult and technical and outside of the range of my knowledge to being utterly clear, like perfectly lucid. And it was almost as if, as I was staring and listening, his awareness was entering me and just clarifying the text through me. And in that experience, I really felt like I was in the presence of an extraordinarily long lineage of reading and Sanskrit scholarship. And I could actually feel that stream of knowledge there. And just the power of the clarity that was being scattered onto the text, I felt this extraordinary joy, even though we were reading about meta rules and grammar.
Yeah, that's amazing. I've had that experience also, even just with reading Western texts. I mean, I don't think it's a Sanskrit lineage thing necessarily. I think it's just like profound teaching, which is always in some kind of lineage, has that effect. And I've also had the experience of having that experience with a text when I'm reading it with someone I really admire, and then just losing it, looking back at the text 2 weeks later or a month later or a year later, and it's like the fire's gone out and you can't find what it was that was like so lit up when you were reading it.
Yeah. That's funny you mentioned that. After I had that experience, I was actually wishing I could just stay there in Pondicherry and read with him for like 10 years. This would be so amazing and so edifying if that could be possible. So I would eventually not lose it. and be dependent on his mastery. So wonderful.
So what are we going to read today, Ben?
So today we're beginning with our text, the Īśvarapratyabhijñākārikā, this foundational work of non-dual Śiva philosophy, which we introduced in our last video. And it's really an important text, and we've chosen to focus on chapter 4. And we gave a little bit of a reason in the last video of why. Chapter 4 is really a sangraha. It's a summation or a summary of the core thesis of this tradition. And it's written in a very accessible way. It's not nearly as technical as the rest of the text. So it's a great introduction to this system of philosophy. So basically, as James, as you mentioned last video, we're going to be reading the text itself. We're going to be looking at the auto commentary by Utpaladeva, but there's also 2 commentaries by Abhinavagupta. And so by reading this foundational work in Śiva philosophy, we're also going to be dipping into Abhinavagupta's commentary and learning from his different glosses and his different insights into the text. And so here we actually have Abhinavagupta's introduction to chapter 4. So in the thought of time, I won't read the Sanskrit for this. I'll just read the English. This is what Abhinavagupta says we have in store for us with chapter 4. So Shiva's nature as the essence of our self, well established through self-awareness, reasoning, and scripture, has been extensively examined in the first 3 chapters. That same teaching is now revealed through 18 verses as a summation of the true meaning of revelation. The reason for this summary is for this teaching to enter into the minds of students in a concise form. So just to elaborate a little on this point, Abhinavagupta is saying, look, this is the core thesis of this tradition that it's setting itself out to demonstrate philosophically. That thesis is who we truly are, the essence of ourself, our Atma Swarupam, is actually Shiva. It's this non-dual consciousness, which we'll continue exploring. And so this has been explored in many different ways in previous chapters, but here, in order to really allow that to become established in our understanding, for it to enter into our minds, this summation is being given, and this is exactly what we're about to explore. And let me just say one other thing that Abhinavagupta shares before we go to the verse itself. He gives a beautiful outline. This is kind of one of his duties as a commentary that he follows very astutely. He gives an outline of the entire chapter. And so here's the outline he gives. He says the first verse, which we'll read today, is simply on the nature of the self. Then he describes that verses 2 through 10 really follow a shared theme at looking at the nature of contraction. If our true nature is all pervasive consciousness, why do we not experience that fact?
Why does our consciousness seem limited or feel limited, which would be the connection to the idea of contraction specifically?
Exactly. And another word for that process is concealment, or as we'll explore, self-concealment, right? Verses 11 through 17 then speak about the process of awakening or recognizing that the integrity of our innate consciousness, when that contracting ignorance has been dispelled. And finally, we get this verse 18, which is a conclusion. So this gives me a chance to just really briefly give you a sense of where we're going to be going and what's to come. Today, we're going to focus on this first verse and a number of ancillary issues related to it, just to get a better sense of this philosophical system, some of its core tenets. In the next video, we're not going to just read one verse per video. We'll probably read 3 or 4 verses of the second section, 2 through 10, and then we'll continue that way. And then we'll probably end with verse 18. So maybe over the course of 5 episodes, we'll complete this chapter together. That's kind of the plan right now. We'll see how it unfolds. All right, so
here we go. Here it is.
Here we go. This is it. Chapter 4, verse 1. So the name of the chapter, Tattva Sangraha Adhikara, the summation of the principles of reality, the tattvas, the kind of truth of this philosophical system. So the verse goes something like this. Swatmaiva sarvajantunam eka eva maheshwaraha vishwarupoham idam itya kandamarsha brahmitaha. And the translation: the one innate self of all beings is Shiva. The Swatma, the innate self, which is Eka, which is just one, is Maheshwara, another name for Shiva. Becoming everything, Vishvarupa. That self expands, Brahmita, with the undivided awareness, Aham Idam, I am all this. All right, that's the verse. We're going to break it down piece by piece in the next few slides as we move together. I'm going to pass the mic to James so he can share some different relevant elements. But before we do that, let's just look at what Utpaladeva, the author of this text, has to say about his own verse. So this is his auto comment. He says, Ekaha pratama upadeya turya dashayam akandita grahaka akandita grahya tanmelana chamatkara upabrahmitaha sadharana eva sarva praninam atma vishwarupo maheshwaraha. The one self of all sentient beings, he's explaining his own words, one with everything, Vishwarupa, is Shiva. That self expands with the wondrous awareness of the undivided knowing subject, the undivided unity of all objects of perception, and their complete fusion in the fourth state, the Turiya Dasha, which is the principal goal of human life. This is liberation. Thus, that self is truly universal. Sadharana. Okay, so we're going to explore this. I just wanted to read our translation, introduce you to the text, have you have a chance to hear it. Should we move on to the next thing? Anything before we do so?
No, I think we should talk about Amarsha.
All right, let's do it.
So this is one of the things that there's a lot to unpack in this text, and if the fourth chapter is a kind of like Sangraha chapter, the first verse of the fourth chapter is like a Sangraha of the Sangraha. So then therefore in this verse, we have a lot of concepts that are kind of fundamental to Utpaladeva's system and to Abhinavagupta's system. So the first one that's worth pointing out is this Amarsha. You see, Akanda Marsha Brimhita. This is one of the fundamental concepts in the whole system, and it goes by a couple different names. And they're all cognates of this verb root mrish. So we have Marsha, the most common one is Vi Marsha, Pari Marsha. Am I leaving any out, Ben? Are there any other mrish terms?
Pratyava Marsha.
Pratyava Marsha, yeah, a lot of them, a lot of different cognates, and they all have very similar meanings. And it's part of a sort of fundamental dialectic or polarity built into Shiva himself. So Shiva has two fundamental aspects. And since Shiva is awareness and Shiva is all things, all awareness and all things has these aspects. One is prakasha. And prakasha means light, but it means the kind of like awareness part of awareness. The kind of like the consciousness part of it. And then you have Vimarsha or Amarsha, which is the consciousness's reflexivity, its relationship with itself. So you could translate this as self-awareness. You could translate it as self-grasping, self-interpretation. It's the fact that Shiva is not just aware, but he is also aware of himself being aware. And that is often lined up with the kind of quasi-sexual imagery or even sexual imagery of the divine in this tradition. So you have Shiva in union in Yamala, in union with his partner, Shakti, the goddess. She has many different names. And Shiva is often identified in that polarity with Prakasha, and Shakti is the Vimarsha. And it's really the Vimarsha that kind of makes all things possible, because the Prakasha is just aware of things. The Vimarsha is the ability to then interpret them and shift them around. So the ability to take the kind of unified mass of all things and start to divide it up into the objects that we know, and then recombine those objects in various relationships. All of that is the power of Vimarsha, because it implies that Shiva is interacting with himself, and it's this self-interaction that's captured by Vimarsha. The term itself, even it has been pointed out that it has somewhat sexual connotations. Mrish means to like touch or rub or stroke, and in some aspects of Sanskrit literature, it has a much more obvious sexual connotation. It doesn't have like an ordinary human sexual connotation here, but the eroticism of the divine, the kind of like eros built into the divine, I think is a part of this word. That Shiva and Shakti are not just interacting with each other, but they're interacting with each other intimately and pleasurably. So I'm going to talk about the pleasure in a minute, but one of the very important aspects of Vimarsha is that it is a form of action. So action, because it's a self-interaction, action is built into awareness itself. And all ordinary forms of action are a kind of outflow or outward expression of this most fundamental aspect of action. So Ben, you want to say a little bit more about action in this system?
Sure, absolutely. So yeah, here again, we're describing Akhanda Amarsha Brahmita, this expanding of these different senses of an unbroken Amarsha. This would be an Amarsha that includes all things, not just a fragmented representation or experience. And I really appreciate this point you made, James, that this element of Prakasha and Vimarsha is not only a description of the universal self, but you can really analyze it at all levels. Nonetheless, in this verse, in this summation of the summation, the sangraha of the sangraha, it's here referring to Maheshwara, that Maheshwara is expanding with this self-awareness. And this self-awareness is a dynamic action. It's an action of experiencing Shiva consciousness, experiencing itself, of representing itself to itself. And this actually ties to a really important doctrine in this system. And the doctrine is that Shiva, as the kind of the word that connotes the highest reality and the true nature of the self, is an agent not only of action, but an agent of all awareness, all knowledge, all cognition. And here we can actually make a really useful distinction with other models, other traditions in India, other traditions of liberation that posit a notion of the highest reality that is beyond all action and immutable. There's a few traditions that do this. Sankhya and Patanjali's yoga both posit kind of the liberated consciousness as unchanging, beyond all action. And also the Advaita Vedanta tradition of the great Indian philosopher Shankara makes this point as well. Any kind of change or action or cause and effect or diversity is really comparable to a projection or an illusion. It's not ultimately real. What is ultimately real is unchanging and immutable. In this tradition, that is not the case. And in fact, this is really at the heart of the philosophical argument of how is it that we know that we are this Shiva? Well, we actually are invested with the powers to know and to act. And when we recognize that we have these powers, this tradition argues that those powers aren't unique to any one individual. They're actually features of consciousness, which is self-differentiating as this world process. And so, James, when you're breaking down the text, you're using your mind, you're using your body, you're acting, you're thinking about it. When I'm breaking down the text, I might do it a little differently based on my own experience and knowledge. And the conventional experience is your action is yours and mine is mine. And that is true in a relative world. But this tradition argues that they're really all a part, they're all shared part of one power of action and one power of knowing. And that really what consciousness is the dynamic agent of all action and of all knowing. And the fact that we are actors, the fact that we have minds is actually evidence for us to recognize that we're participating in this agency, in this consciousness. It's through those powers that we recognize this. So I want to make one more contrast with another understanding of liberation. In this tradition, part of the mythological background is that this highest deity that in the non-dual form we're identifying with, that we're realizing as our own self, is Shiva, who is not just a kind of deity on high, but is also the creative source of the universe, is the creator of the universe. And so this deity has this kind of agency as creator. And so in these tantric traditions, which this is an elaboration of, we're actually identifying with the deity that is a creator. And that's why we get this very dynamic understanding of liberation, which includes action, which includes, you know, the mind, which includes this immanent world by extension, right? And that can be contrasted very briefly, I'll do this, to certain Buddhist tantric traditions. I know a lot of you may be interested in and maybe have practiced some Buddhist tantric traditions, and it's true that there's a lot shared with Shaivism historically. In particular, non-dual Shaivism has certain things in common with Dzogchen and with other kind of practices, in that they emphasize kind of sudden realization and spontaneity of realization, and they kind of push aside ritual and a lot of, you know, very technical forms of practice. There's also a transmission, like mind-to-mind transmission from the guru. There's the use of poetry for awakening. There's a really beautiful overlap. But there's still a question, what is it that we're realizing in both traditions? What's the fundamental view? And in Tantric Buddhist traditions, the deities, the Tantric deities, are not creator deities. They're seen to be either Buddhas or Bodhisattvas. And Buddhist traditions do acknowledge that there are other deities who can be assigned that role. But that's really not the nature of Buddha, or this kind of consciousness or Buddha nature that the Buddha represents. And so I think this is an interesting distinction. What in our moment of realization, what are we identifying with? Are we identifying with the dynamic source of creation and action and agency? Are we becoming a cosmic agent? Or are we identifying with awareness that has other qualities, right? Like whatever they may be, you know, be it overflowing compassion or other extraordinary ways that realization is taught in those traditions.
Yeah, so that idea of action, yeah, I think you put it really well. I mean, it distinguishes this from Vedanta on the one hand, where the ultimate is consciousness but is completely inactive, and also from Buddhism, where there's a very different idea of what a tantric deity or what ultimate consciousness is like. But one of the things that is shared through those three traditions that you also find here is this idea that ultimate awareness is blissful. And this idea of delight or bliss is present here in this verse with this word. Well, it's in the commentary, chamatkara. Chamatkara is a word that means it means delight or bliss, and it is actually a word, I believe it originates in discussions of poetry and theater. I actually don't know that for sure. Do you know where does the word come from tantric traditions into theater, or it comes from theater into?
I think the earlier usage is probably in theater. And
yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah.
That's my intuition, but we could check.
So there's a kind of, so Shiva here is not just awareness and self-awareness combined. There's a certain blissfulness to that. And you could ask the question, why is that blissful? Abhinavagupta Utpaladeva, this tradition actually gives a reason why it's blissful. And it's a philosophical reason. And the reasoning given is that pain, all pain and suffering is simply defined as a feeling of lack in some way, a feeling of missing something or being separated from something. And Shiva, when he is fully aware of himself, when his vimarsha is complete, he is aware of himself as all things and lacking nothing. So there's a complete absence of pain, which just is by definition in this tradition, pleasure. Now, what's important about that, I mentioned that this takes place like along all different levels of the universe and in our experience as well. This also, for at least for Abhinavagupta and probably for Utpaladeva as well, although it's a little more, a little less elaborated for him. This explains all human forms of pleasure. So for Abhinavagupta, all human experiences of pleasure are experiences in which your mind is, first of all, put into contact with itself, aware of itself, and then aware of itself as being full or satiated in some way. It's a temporary experience of oneself as lacking a need that one previously had. And this can happen in all sorts of ways. It can, and it's described it's connected to all sorts of experiences. Eating a delicious meal, for example, and feeling full afterwards. The pleasure of that is a small portion of Shiva's vimarsha of himself as not having lack. Sex, of course, be another example of this. And the highest form of this in the human realm is theater and poetry. Theater and poetry is the closest that ordinary human pleasures can get to this kind of full-blown spiritual vimarsha. And the reason is very interesting. The reason that Abhinava gives for this, the reason that art is at the top of the hierarchy of pleasures, is because it's the one that is most disconnected from external objects. It's the least dependent on external material objects. And so it's the one in which you are most able to detach from your needs and experience yourself as lacking.
Beautiful. Do you want to say anything about, as you were speaking, you're reminding me of a really important related concept to this sense of fullness that it's kind of at the heart of the experience of bliss or pleasure. What about repose or vishranti? That's a piece of that, right?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, because this is another really important, vishranti means to like take one's rest or repose as you translate. And it's a kind of like position or attitude that the mind can be put into by various things. So when you start to let go of your needs for external objects and start to savor your own experience, you experience a moment of repose in oneself. But the concept's actually more complicated than that, right? Because it can mean to be located. It can simply mean for some phenomenon to be located in a place. So for example, we were just reading this the other day, that all external objects find repose within subjectivity, meaning that's where they take place, that's where they get their existence from, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And how would you contrast that kind of relishing from, someone who's just experiencing sense pleasures? I mean, you mentioned there's like a kind of active repose as you're relishing or as you're enjoying something. How would you distinguish that form of enjoyment?
I mean, I think in terms of repose, I think repose is there for any sort of pleasure. There's a moment of repose, but just like the vimarsha, it admits of degrees. So there can be like sort of partial or complete vimarshas. So when you eat a delicious meal and you're just kind of like caught up in the experience of the pleasure, and you're no longer as like, you no longer feel deprived of what you wanted. You do experience a moment of repose, but it's a small moment of repose, and it's a moment of repose that's still dependent to some extent on various factors, such as external objects, but also your own individuality. And the less those two factors are present as part of the repose, the less you're dependent on external objects and the less you're dependent on your own individuality, both of which for Abhinavagupta dissolve partially during the experience of art. The more complete the vimarsha is, and therefore the more complete the bliss is.
Thanks. That's a very clear elaboration of that. And I think that's part of what this tradition is really doing is these things are already happening. It's just what is our degree of self-awareness about what is unfolding already.
Right.
Like repose is already present. There already is this Shiva's, dynamism is already unfolding in and through our experience, but we're just not actually aware of it. Another thing in the background before we move to the next slide is the text of Vijnana Bhairava, which some of you may be aware of. This text has a lot of practices that are kind of correspond to this discussion. There's practices where you're meant to savor listening to music, or you're meant to eat food and learn how to savor it in a certain way. And the key to that savoring process is to not associate the bliss exclusively with the object, but to find a way to make that kind of spark of bliss or delight allow you to rest in the source of bliss, which is the self, which already is complete and therefore is blissful.
Yeah.
And
one quick thing that I've always kind of wondered about, Ben, and I don't know, you might know more about this than me. This connection to Dzogchen is really interesting to me. Particularly because I believe in the Dzogchen tradition, there is a corollary of Prakasha Vimarsha. There is this idea that the true nature of mind is both aware and self-aware. It didn't, as far as I know, and I could be wrong, I don't know enough about the Dzogchen tradition as I should. Dzogchen never developed a theory of aesthetics in this way, the way Tantric Shaivism did. And I've always sort of wondered why that is. Maybe I'm overlooking something.
Well, maybe we could have some guests. I mean, that's one of the things we're going to do is invite some of our friends who are scholars of Buddhism, including Tibetan Buddhism. So that could be a great thing to explore. I know that there are great Buddhist poets and that there's a deep tradition of poetry in Buddhism. And I know that a lot of these texts are aesthetically beautiful and powerful. And potent. So it's definitely alive in the transmission of the tradition. To what extent, like Abhinavagupta, was it theorized?
Yeah, that's what I'm asking about. Yeah,
that's another thing to explore. I mean, I know that you know this too, that Dundin, the great literary theorist, was drawn upon by certain Tibetan scholastics and authors and so they wrote on literary theory, but exactly how they relate it to these highest, most subtle experiences would be really, really interesting to explore.
Yeah, I haven't, to my knowledge, they don't. It's not connected to, they're interested in like other things, but they don't go all the way with it the way Abhinavagupta, this kind of like chamatkara, like I haven't seen that, but I would love to get a specialist on and ask them. I think we should totally do that.
Yeah, we should do that for sure. One more thing, I think this is another place in the text where people can connect to this tradition and its different methods of awakening. I know that a lot of people who really love music have had certain kind of transcendental experiences at a show or listening to certain music they really love. The other day I was listening to Miles Davis' Bitches Brew, and I had a moment where I became so absorbed into the kind of flow and emotion and feeling in the track that I was just really resting there. And then once I was resting there, it was like every little nuance was just adding more joy and pleasure and was more and more evocative. So it's like, how can we find a piece of music? Or some people are more, tactile and have an extraordinary sense of touch or fragrance, or taste, like some people like who can drink different teas or wine, right? So how can you rest there long enough with full awareness and to kind of get to the essence of that experience?
Yeah.
Nice.
You were Chamatkara Upabrimhita listening to Miles Davis.
Upabrimhita with Miles Davis. Yeah. I've been going into jazz lately, just as kind of with historical curiosity as well, listening to a lot of Miles Davis and John Coltrane.
That's great.
Yeah. So part of this Upabrimhita is this other element of the commentary. This is again Utpaladeva commenting on his own verse. Where is the context for this expansion of this undivided awareness, this akanda amarsha? The context is what Utpaladeva describes as the fourth state. This happens in the fourth state. And this is a really interesting element of the Shaiva philosophy. We see it in the Shiva Sutras as well, a number of discussions of the four states: waking, dream, deep sleep, and then this beyond deep sleep state. And I think I think this is something to explore in future episodes. In fact, it's a really understudied area. Samdev Vasudeva, in his book, The Yoga of the Malini Vijayottara Tantra, speaks about it in this one tantric text. Besides that, I haven't seen anyone really explore Shiva dream yoga. This idea of like, how do we move into consciously through states of dream and deep sleep with this kind of continuous thread of awareness. That's this fourth state, which is all encompassing, in which the undivided subject, all objective reality, and their fusion is all choreographed in this great symphony. So that's a bit of a teaser for you all, that this is maybe a special episode that we're going to look into.
Well, even more of a teaser, Ben, we could point out that that's a big point of overlap with Buddhism.
Yes.
That dream yoga and the fourth state. And that might be something we could explore too.
Yeah. And I have a good friend here in Boulder, Colorado, Andrew Holacek, who is a very prolific author on dream yoga in Buddhist tradition, and also a teacher. So he had me on his podcast. So we should have him as well. That'd be great.
Yeah.
He's been asking me to explore that.
Cool.
So yeah, that's our verse. I just want to conclude by mentioning again kind of what our plan is. So we've done the first verse on the nature of the self. The nature of the self is this all-inclusive, all-embracing consciousness called Shiva. Where we're going next is, well, why the hell don't we experience that? You can almost imagine the natural response. Like, that sounds great. Why is that not the case, that this is true to my own experience? And there's a lot of philosophical points that are really interesting and rich, to a kind of theory of ignorance that really helps us appreciate other elements like the freedom of consciousness, self-concealment, the way in which Shiva is playing hide and seek with himself. So there's a lot to explore that will actually be interesting. And then we're going to move on to the process of liberation. There's sharing of a few practices, which are core practices, working with one's vikalpas, or one's ideas or thought concepts. And then this stunning poetic verse to conclude the text.
I can't wait.
Yeah, I can't wait. I wish we could fast forward to the next episode. This is too much fun. So yeah, lovely to be with you all. Great to read with you, James.
Yeah, great to read with you, Ben. I'll see you next time.
Okay, sounds good.
All right.